Welcome to the Jordan B.Peterson podcast. I'm Michaela. This is episode 12, season 4. This episode was recorded on March 12th and is with the one, the only, Jocko Willink. Dad has been on Jocko's podcast several times in the past, but now had the opportunity to reverse the interviewing role to learn more about Jocko's life and endeavors. They discussed Jocko's experience in the military and war-exploring time in the Navy SEALs, Afghanistan and Iraq, and much more. Jocko Willink is an American best-selling author, podcaster, and retired naval officer who served in the Navy SEALs. Jocko also has one of the most successful podcasts out there, the Jocko Podcast. Please remember to rate and subscribe if you enjoy this content. This episode is brought to you by NordVPN. I don't know how this is allowed, but with NordVPN, you can unlock Netflix and your favorite entertainment websites. I use one while I'm traveling. Did you know you can't get Disney in some countries? NordVPN has a 30-day money-back guarantee and unlimited bandwidth. A VPN connection establishes a secure connection between you and the internet. Via the VPN, all your data traffic is routed through an encrypted virtual tunnel. NordVPN has an extension for Chrome browser, which is lightweight and user-friendly with the first click. It secures your browsing in seconds. You can have 6 simultaneous connections, and for NordVPN's birthday, every purchase of a 2-year plan will get you 1 additional month free and a surprise gift. Go to nordvpn.com/Peterson and use code Peterson. Enjoy this episode.
Hi, everybody. I'm pleased today to be talking with Jocko Willink, who I've talked with on his podcast on 3 separate occasions. I don't think I've had Jocko on mine, and my memory isn't what it should be. But I'm quite sure that so far when we've talked, it's been on your podcast. So I thought I'd take the time today to get to know you in some more detail. Jocko is an American author, podcaster, and retired naval officer who served in the Navy SEALs. He co-authored the books Extreme Ownership and The Dichotomy of Leadership with fellow retired SEAL Leif Babin. Did I pronounce that right?
It's actually Leif Babin.
Oh, so I didn't pronounce it right at all. Leif Babin. He hosts a weekly podcast with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner Echo Charles called the Jocko Podcast. He has 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and his podcast attracts many more listeners. He co-founded the management consulting firm Echelon Front LLC and has extended his business development on a number of additional fronts. His military service included combat actions in the war in Iraq, where he eventually commanded the SEAL Teams 3 Task Unit Bruiser that fought in the battle against the Iraqi insurgents in Ramadi, and was honored with the Silver Star and Bronze Star for his service. He achieved the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Good to see you again, Jocko.
It's good to be here.
I feel the same way, that it's good to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I'm glad
that you were able to gut through that ridiculously long bio, and I felt that as you got to the end of it, you were breaking free of the chains of that reading. So I'm glad it's over with.
Yeah, well, it's so much better just to talk than to read in this sort of format. But at least everybody who doesn't know already has some sense of who you are, some minimal sense of who you are. So tell me what's been happening online with you over the last couple of years, because we haven't spoken. I would say it's got to be 2 years, I think, something like that. And so I've cast an eye on what's been happening with you on YouTube, and some of my staff have filled me in, but I'm really curious. Tell me about what's happening with your YouTube channel and your online activities, your podcast, and all of that.
A few years ago, I started a podcast. That was quite a few years ago now. It was in 2015. It might have been kind of as the explosion prior to the explosion of podcasts. In fact, I think I read something that said at that time, it was like 17% of Americans were listening to podcasts, and that number's much, much higher now. And I kind of got lucky because at the time, Tim Ferriss had one of the most popular, still very popular, but at the time, just because the numbers of podcasts that existed, his podcast was even more popular. And I went on his podcast, and when we got done recording and he pressed stop on the record button, he looked at me and said, "You should have your own podcast." And I kind of took that, and noted it. And then a little while later, I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he had, obviously another one of the most popular podcasts in the world. And he told me in the middle of that podcast that I should have my own podcast. And so when guys like Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan are telling you to have your own podcast, you have your own podcast. Now, I came to realize later that Joe Rogan actually would tell everybody to have a podcast. So maybe, he would tell everyone, "Oh, you should start a podcast." Well, I actually listened to him. And so I started that podcast, and I would say I probably, if somebody would have asked, what should a person do to make a good podcast, or maybe not a good podcast, but a popular podcast, somebody would probably say, make it probably a half an hour to an hour, bring a bunch of different guests on so that you can hear a bunch of different people talking, and talk about positive things in the world. And so instead of doing any of that, what I did was I have a podcast that's between 2 and 5 hours long. Oftentimes it's just me talking, reading from a book and reviewing a book. And usually the books are about war or suffering or some kind of human atrocity. And so that's what my podcast is. And really what it boils down to is it's learning about human nature. And for me, human nature is best revealed, or most clearly revealed, in times of suffering. And one of the, I guess, a pretty good monopoly on the market for suffering is war, and right in there as well as, human atrocities. So I started that podcast, and like I said, when I started it, there weren't as many as podcasts as there are now. So it got some traction out of the gate, and it kind of just stayed there. So I was very lucky in that respect, and I've been doing it ever since. I've put out one podcast a week for 5 years. I've only missed one week in there, and that was when my best friend was killed in a parachute accident, and so I didn't put out a podcast that week. But other than that, I've been very consistent. And then the YouTube channel is, well, it's kind of the podcast, and then we do some excerpts there and little clips and stuff like that. And Echo Charles, I forget what you called him in the bio, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. He's also